Welcome to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Welcome, folks who are following us online. As we like to say, come on in. We're going to get started in a second. Good afternoon. I am Professor Larry Jacobs. I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the Humphrey Schools, which is the School of Public Affairs for the University of Minnesota. Before we begin, I want to invite all of you who are following us online to participate. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. Click that. That's the way you can give us questions, which we are eager to get and we will incorporate in our conversation. Also, you'll see next to it a transcript. If you'd like a live transcript, just click that button, you'll get that as well. Thank you for joining us for today's program, The Restoration of Congress. Our guest today is U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon. Senator Merkley was first elected in 2008. He's been a progressive leader in the Senate on immigration, finance reform, and a number of other issues, including climate. We are just delighted to have you with us so much, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Great to be here.
Before being elected to the U.S. Senate, Mr. Merkley was a 5-term member of the Oregon House of Representatives and served as Speaker from 2007 to 2009. I'm often asked by students, how do I get involved in politics? And my response is participate. Work for a campaign, get elected to the school board, run for state House or Senate, and then think about your other options. And Senator Merkley is a great example of that. We are delighted to have you here, and you've been talking quite a bit about the need to reform how the Senate operates. And to me, this is interesting because I think of you as a progressive policy shop on immigration some time ago, on voting rights after the 2000 election, climate, and a number of other areas, including finance. You've been a policy leader, and now you're talking about changing how the Senate operates, its procedures around debate. What has brought you to this moment where you're really picking up the effort to change how the Senate operates?
Well, greetings, everyone. Part of my journey, I'm a blue-collar kid who never anticipated that I'd be involved in national politics, but always thought, what can I do to make the world a better place? Which led me into policy in a number of dimensions. When I was in college, I was struggling with, well, what am I going to do? I have a mind wired for math and science, but an interest in philosophy and history and international affairs. And someone said, hey, you should consider an internship with a U.S. Senator. And so I sent out a bunch of applications, and Senator Hatfield adopted me for a summer. And in that summer, I was assigned to work on the Tax Reform Act in 1976. And if you go back and look at that, you will see that there were 125 votes on that bill. Every single one a simple majority. Simple majority, motion to proceed to the floor, amendment after amendment after amendment, all dealing with taxes. Whoever wanted to put up an amendment, no matter what powerful group that they might be stepping on, could do so. Final passage, simple majority, no supermajority to close debate, no supermajority get on the floor. I came back to the Senate in 2009. 2008 election came in 2009, and I couldn't believe how much the Senate had changed. It started to go through this massive transformation from simple majority to supermajority. Now, the transformation had been struggled with in the early 70s, and Mondale had played a critical role in a reform in 1975. And that reform had taken the numbers needed to close debate from a higher supermajority of 2/3 to lower supermajority of 3/5, and had some other twists to it. But essentially on most things, the Senate was still simple majority. They were very upset at that point that they were having 12 or more motions to close debate that took a supermajority a year. We now have well over 100. This transformation has changed the Senate from a place where senators have a superpower to where they have no superpower. What's a superpower? Was the ability to do an amendment on any topic, take on any interest. But when you need both parties to essentially give consent for an amendment or for a bill to be on the floor, the powerful are now well protected. It means that you simply can't put up an amendment that says, hey, this tax break is wrong and it should be stripped away, and get it voted on. Cannot happen. And in a democracy, in a republic, we believe in the vision of power flowing up from the people, but the powerful have a different vision of what they want to achieve. They have this understanding that, well, we've got lawyers and we've got lobbyists and we've got media campaigns to influence how people think. And we have regular campaign money to help people who will back us. And we've got dark money to smear people who we don't like. And if everything else fails now, we've got the supermajority or the filibuster. And so if we do not reform the Senate, we lose the vision of government of, by, and for the people. And as an advocate for ordinary families, that's why I care about reform of the Senate.
And could you give us some examples? I mean, this is, kind of very provocative and probably for a lot of people appealing to hear, you're going to fight against the powerful. But what are some examples of how the filibuster has been used by the powerful?
Well, let's take for example when Senator Kennedy undertook the equality for the LGBT community in the sphere of employment. The bill was called ANDA, Employment Non-Discrimination Act. So he had it on the floor of the Senate in 1996. He lost 50-49. No supermajority on a cultural issue, passionate feelings about. He lost by 1 vote. The senator who was missing would have voted for it. Al Gore would have voted for it. Okay, so Kennedy in 2009 was ill with brain cancer. Because I had led the fight for the Equality Act in Oregon, he asked me to lead the fight for ENDA, carry the torch forward. So I got that bill to the floor of the Senate. I no longer needed 50 votes and a vice president. I needed 60. And that changed that dynamic considerably. I was just thinking, yesterday I was being interviewed about saving the land use system in Oregon when I was speaker. We won by 1 vote. If that had been the United States of America in the Senate, we would have lost. We would not have saved our land use system. And then if we look at bill after bill after bill, you see the tip of the iceberg are the bills that are defeated on the floor that have a majority, but not a supermajority. And, but then there's all the bills that never make it to the floor because you can't get the 60 votes for motion to proceed. So the majority leader says, we can't spend a week on a motion to proceed because it takes a week's time to process that motion that was supposed to be very rare. So you have all these things that just never even get there. So it's like that hidden iceberg of bills. But a very good example specifically is the Disclose Act. The Disclose Act was one portion of the goal of the For the People Act. The For the People Act, Senate Bill number 1 in 2021, was my bill that took on dark money. It took on gerrymandering, and it protected the ballot box for every American by guaranteeing some element in every state election of vote by mail and some element of early voting. So you can't have all the shenanigans on election day. Well, we lost that, but then we put one element up, the Disclose Act, and separately. And the Disclose Act it had the majority, but not 60 votes. Twice back under Obama, we put it up and it had 59 votes, but not 60. So, I mean, with the reform of 75, the Mondale reform, it went from a percent of those who were voting to simply a straight 60 votes, a percent of senators enrolled. And so you can win 59-0, you lose. And so I think given the protection of our democracy, probably the loss of the For the People Act and the Disclose Act are very good examples.
Yeah, just to be clear, this is one of these seemingly small points, but absolutely monumental. The shift to from the senators present to those who are sworn in is huge, because in the old days, you needed to have the people on the floor. So you needed to make an effort to get the folks on the floor. Now you don't even have to show up. It's just, I intend to filibuster, and you can go get a hamburger or take a nap. It doesn't really matter.
No, because you're no vote just by not even appearing. The filibuster, word filibuster, is derived from the Dutch word for freebooter, basically pirate. And so it was considered piracy to obstruct a vote on a bill. And the Senate was designed around simple majority. And so the piracy was changing that dynamic and making it unable to actually hold a vote. And it has had very interesting chapters in the history of the Senate that's brought us to the current day of the no effort filibuster, which really isn't a filibuster at all, because it doesn't involve talking, doesn't involve motions on the floor, doesn't involve going through. It just means you have to have 60 votes, which means each party, if they can control 41 votes, has a veto, except that veto doesn't apply to certain bills, which has created an imbalance between the ability of Republicans to campaign and deliver on their campaign promises, and Democrats' ability to campaign and deliver on their campaign promises.
You're talking about the budget process for Republicans?
Yes. So two things. The primary top two issues that Republicans campaign on are tax cuts and court appointments or confirmations. So both can be done by simple majority. Now, the interesting thing on the court appointments is Democrats and Republicans both had a hand in doing that as they obstructed each other, and the majority got frustrated. But the issue of tax cuts has to do with a story that basically almost nobody, I don't think even senators do not know this story. So we'll just let you in on this little secret background here is there were 100 senators. Every single senator supported a special filibuster-free pathway in order to be able to reduce the deficit. And you had the majority leader, minority leader, both parties, chairs of the budget committee, all on board. And this is back in 1974, the Deficit Control Act. Everyone say, okay, deficit's so threatening. And, they were talking about, oh, they've risen to $5 billion. And today that hardly seems a thing, but it was a big deal then when it had gone up from 1 billion. And so time passes, and 20 years later, it's going to take a revolution to undo this unanimous support, bipartisan support for deficit control. And the revolution was the Gingrich Revolution. So Gingrich comes into power, and first they're going to do a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. And but they fell one vote short of Senator Hatfield. Would not provide his vote. He was chair of the spending committee, appropriations. He was also my political mentor, so full disclosure. And so they didn't get that done. Then they did a line item veto, and the Supreme Court struck down the line item veto. And then they said, let's take the filibuster-free pathway that everyone agreed on for deficit control and use it to do a massive increase in the deficit. So here were the so-called fiscal hawks, and they repurposed it through what we would call today a nuclear option. They did a reinterpretation of the rule that had been unanimously supported, and said this can now be used for increasing deficits. And so they've created a filibuster-free pathway for their top priority. Meanwhile, if you're a Democrat and you're running on better policy for healthcare, housing, education, jobs, equality, climate, and so forth, Mitch McConnell has a veto over that. He can control 41 votes and stop those policies.
Let's ask the obvious question, which is, aren't you talking about changing the intent of the U.S. Constitution? Did James Madison intend for there to be the filibuster and the blockade on quick, ill-considered action?
So I know the professor knows the answer to this, so thank you for that softball. When the founders were writing the Constitution, they were under the Confederation Congress, which required a supermajority. And so they were adamant, this is paralyzing us. We couldn't raise the money to take on Shays' rebellion. We couldn't pay the pensions from the Revolutionary War. Whatever you do, simple majority. And you have in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and Madison ranting about the fact that the filibuster will produce tempestuous compromises of the common good and so on and so forth. You know, very powerful language like America never make the mistake of having a supermajority for legislation. And the Constitution was written very clearly with supermajority only for very special circumstances, like throwing out a member, like confirming a treaty, overriding a veto. And they didn't feel they needed to say, and by the way, legislation is simple majority, because everyone understood that that was the case. Furthermore, the initial Senate had a series of structures that would have prevented anything that looked like a filibuster. And they had what I call the code. And the code developed, the British Parliament had rules for not being able to go on in a tedious manner in a long speech. And the Speaker of the Parliament could call to order a member. That power was in original rules for our original presiding officer or the vice president presiding in this Senate. They had the Jefferson Code, which took the British code, and basically he wrote a book about how the Senate should behave. He said no tedious speeches. So you had the power to call to order. You had the Jefferson Guide. You had Jefferson serving for 4 years as the vice president who was presiding over the Senate. And then they had the previous question. And the previous question is something that has a very interesting story in American history, because essentially it was unused through 1806. Unused because they didn't need it because they had the code. You didn't have to stop a filibuster if there were no filibusters. They did, in fact, move the previous question 10 times. And 3 times they actually ended debate and held a vote. But it wasn't because they were facing a filibuster. It was just because, in fact, they thought, well, this particular motion, the previous question, is unlike anything else. In the British system, developed in 1604, they proceeded to say this motion will have 2 effects. If it passes, it calls for an immediate vote. If it fails, we will delay voting by 1 day or delay the debate for 1 day. So along comes, if we fast forward from the founding through 1841, you have Calhoun, who is trying to defend the slave economy of the South. And he had tried nullification meaning that each state can decide whether or not a federal law really applies to that state or not. And interestingly, when Calhoun was vice president under Jackson, he had secretly written a doctrine for South Carolina extolling nullification. And nullification was not some crackpot theory. I mean, Jefferson supported nullification. But Jackson, who was a slave owner and president, went crazy and said, no way, that's not the way the Constitution is written. That is the responsibility of the court to decide if something violates the Constitution, not a right of the state. So you had the slaveholder president really trouncing nullification. So along comes this big debate over the plan that Clay was putting forward for a national financial system involving a national bank. You had the Whigs in power with overwhelming elections in 1840. And lo and behold, the South is really worried about this system. And so they proceed to say, how are we going to stop this? And that was the birth of the filibuster. Now, why didn't the previous question stop that? And the answer is because the Senate got rid of it when Aaron Burr in 1806 said, let's rewrite the rules because we don't need it. We've got the code. We've got the courtesy that everyone's listened to, and then we vote. And so they had dumped the previous question rule out of the book, and that came to haunt them later on in 1841.
So you have a proposal. What's your proposal to fix this system we have now, which is blocking substantive legislation? It's blocking amendments. It's blocking nominations. And you see this as unfair because Republicans have other paths and Democrats don't. So what is the solution in your mind?
So if you watch a committee today of the Senate, you will see the old Senate code in operation. You'll see people debating a bill, raising an amendment, working the room, voting on it, and then the chair will look around and say, everybody had their say, okay, we're voting. That's the way the whole Senate used to work. That's the Senate code in operation. But you go to the floor of the Senate and you have these multiple delays. So after a couple things happened in 1964 and then 1975, and the filibuster had the taint of being used for only one purpose. It was used to protect the slave economy of the South. Then it was used to protect the South from civil rights, from the ability of Black Americans to vote, to register, to participate. And so it had a big taint on it. Well, 1964 comes along and they break the filibuster and they pass the Civil Rights Bill. Next year, they pass the Voting Rights Act. And suddenly the filibuster doesn't have as much taint and people start experimenting with using it to block other topics. And this led to the early 70s in 71, 72, 73. You suddenly see going from 2 filibusters a year or 2 blockades of this notion to about 12. And then you see in 73, 74, like 1 or 2 per month. And this is when Mondale steps in to say, we got to fix this. But after the 1975 fix, there's a bit of a improvement in behavior for a couple of years. And then people just start saying, you know what, we have a no effort blockade now. We don't have to debate. We don't have to stay up all night. We don't have to produce a whole series of motions and quorum calls. All we have to do is say, well, you don't have 60, too bad. We're not helping you, giving you any votes so that we can ever vote on this. And it started to be used just on everything. And it started to inhabit, as you mentioned, nominations, though we've now knocked that out. It started to be used on motions to proceed, started to be used on amendments. So right now, the way to approach this is this. It's insane to have 100 talented people spending a week debating whether to debate a bill. That's the motion to proceed. So the reform is 1 hour. Debate it for 1 hour, split the time before those who think we should consider the bill and not, and then vote, simple majority vote. That really would essentially make it what a motion to proceed was before all this terrible dissolution, if you will.
And just to be clear, the motion to proceed is simply, should we actually have a debate on the bill?
The motion to proceed says the Senate will, if it passes, we will debate the bill. That's all it is.
I mean, so there is a kind of an other reality to what's going on. The debate over whether to have a debate is currently a tremendous barrier. So you'll see large, important pieces of legislation like your bill on freedom to vote, which, Democrats felt passionately and many other people felt passionately about. And the barrier of just, can we have a debate on that bill is just remarkable to even get to that point. And so your proposal is, let's just have a 1 hour debate on the debate, and then let's move to the debate.
Exactly. Or have 10 minutes on one to debate the bill. I mean, nobody's really going to be moved by it's just it takes a week because you have to file a motion to close debate. You have to wait 2 days before you vote on it. And then you still have to allow up to 30 hours of debate afterwards before you actually vote on the motion to proceed. So a whole week can be wiped out by this process of debating whether to debate a bill. So it's just a complete waste of time. So that's reform number 1. Reform number 2, amendments. What has happened with amendments is that they've started to be used basically as campaign advertisements. And as a result, majority leaders started to say, well, I'm going to file an amendment and leave it in place so nobody else can file an amendment to prevent the minority from doing campaign advertisements or making our people vote on things we don't want to vote on. And of course, this is very frustrating. My proposed way to address and start to restore the amendment process is to allow germane amendments, starting with 5 by each party, and the ability of the majority minority leader to increase the number. If you have that structure, then germane means the amendment has to be closely related to the text of the bill. And there's an incentive to behave yourself, because if you want to do more amendments, it requires both the majority and the minority leader to agree. You don't want to just be too offensive, because the other side will say, no, we're not doing any more amendments. You just abuse the process. So at least start to flex the muscles of amendments. And those amendments can be things that take on powerful interests potentially. And then the most important part of this is getting to wrap up floor debate to get to a final vote. And what I'm proposing there is the Senate clearly does not want to be the House of Representatives. In the House, the majority just runs over the top of the minority. The Senate treasured the idea that everyone could participate, that everyone could offer amendments, that everyone would have leverage. So how do you balance that desire to have the minority have leverage and yet prevent the minority from exercising a 41-vote veto? And the answer I've proposed is the talking filibuster. And essentially it says this, that if there has been an opportunity for both sides to offer germane amendments, they may not have seized the opportunity, but they had the opportunity, and a certain number thereof, then it can be in order for a simple majority to start a period of extended debate, which is a talking filibuster. And essentially, all of the mechanisms that have been used in the past to essentially interrupt continuous debate, certain motions, quorum calls, and so forth, are set out of order. And it means that the minority or the majority have to carry on continuous debate. If we had done this, and we came within 2 votes of doing this in January of last year, of 2022, we needed 50 votes to say, yes, we're going to have this extended debate on the Freedom to Vote Act, take on the question of gerrymandering and voter suppression and defending the ballot box. And if we'd had those 2 more votes, we would have changed U.S. history, but we didn't have those 2. But what it would have looked like was one speech would have to have followed the other. When there was a break in the speeches, the chair can call the question. That is the tradition of the Senate from the very beginning. Second of all, every senator would have had the ability to speak as long as they wanted twice. That was Rule 4 of the original Senate, and it's still Rule 19 of the existing Senate. So again, rooted in the history and tradition of the Senate. If every minority senator, there was a 50-50 split, has spoke twice for 5 hours each, 10 hours, that's 5,000 hours. That would have been the longest debate in U.S. history. So this is not an effort to just railroad through. In fact, it creates an incentive for both sides to compromise. The incentive for the minority to compromise is it's very hard work maintaining continuous debate day after day after day, through the night, through the weekend, so on and so forth. And for the majority, they cannot afford to have an issue tied up or the floor tied up for 5 weeks or 6 weeks. So incentive for both sides to compromise. On small bills, because right now small bills are blocked by one person saying you need 60 votes, you don't have them, too bad. The small bill never gets a vote, probably never gets considered on the floor. Small bills can now be considered because you would start the debate in the afternoon and then someone would say, well, we're not going to go for a week and I don't want to go through the weekend. So why should I go all night? So therefore, yeah, it's 8 p.m. The East Coast media is shutting down. I think I'll go get dinner. And that'd be the end of it. You'd vote on the bill the next day. And on big bills like Freedom to Vote or like the Equality Act, like the PRO Act, which is protecting the right of workers to organize, things of this nature, like certain climate legislation, things that there were huge divides between the two sides, the debate might well go on for week after week. But that debate would be for the American people. The American people could weigh in. Instead of the filibuster being this secret, silent, no-show, you never see evidence, a trace of it, you would see a battle day and night, and the public could weigh in. Are you a hero? Are you a bum? And there would be a pathway to a final vote.
And so as I see it, and I think you see it, the benefits here is rather than the no show, no effort, I'm going to get a hamburger strategy today, you'd have to actually make an effort. It'd have to be an extraordinary effort. I'm not going to do the hamburger. I'm not going to see my family. Your life is going to stop. And that is going to reduce the number or scope of filibusters because people have other things to do. The second part is transparency. Rather than the kind of mysterious, intent to filibuster, which, let's face it, is not a front page story, usually, then you've got to have your face on it. you've actually got to stand up and be spoken. I think many people remember when, we've had senators who stand up and don't really have much to say. They read from kids' books, and they become a bit of a laughingstock in the country. So the transparency could be in effect. All that to me makes sense. The question, though, I have is this such a huge effort that it's really going to reduce the number of filibusters? I mean, for instance, if you felt very strongly about the Freedom of the Vote Act, you could put together a tag team. You could do this for, you could filibuster, efforts to block it or countermeasures. Let's say restrict abortion. You could put together a tag team who would filibuster for hour after hour. Is this really going to deliver the kind of deliberation that you're talking about?
Mostly, yes. If we think of it in terms of the modest bills and the big bills, there are a handful of topics that the parties are so divided about that the minority might be able to get every member to give long speeches time after time. But it's very difficult to do. Even keeping a debate going through the night for a night or two is difficult. Getting people to sign up and dedicate their weekend. There would be folks who would say, "Oh, I'm going to do a fundraiser. I'm going to be fundraising while I'm speaking on my team." And so yes, there would be occasions that you'd have an extended debate, but isn't an extended debate of a few weeks rather than doing nothing for a few weeks and debating whether to debate a bill a much better place to be on a major issue that then the voters can hold the parties accountable in the next election, and each side would have to decide how far are they willing to go, because essentially people have said, but back when I was working on trying to reform the Senate, because it was just such a shock to me to see how the Senate had deteriorated when I came in 2009. I met with Lamar Alexander, a Republican senator who was considered the Republican who knew the most about the rules, and he said, we just need to go through the night. That's all. We need to go through the night. And then people will quit speaking and we can vote. And if you go back through American history, this has never worked under the current rules. Never. We had many times under many different circumstances where majority leaders and teams went through the night, never broke a filibuster. And part of the reason is because those who were filibustering could look around the room and say there's not a quorum, so they'll do a quorum call, and then it takes several hours to assemble a quorum, and then they do a motion to table, and then you have to hold a vote, and they'd slow walk the vote, and then they do a motion to postpone debate to some other future date. And meanwhile, the majority that wants to close debate has to keep a quorum present, while the minority that is in essence saying they want more debate has to keep one person there talking. So it creates an imbalance of power between the minority and the majority, where it should be the reverse. Those who want more debate should have to carry the weight. Under the talking filibuster, the weight would be equal between the minority and the majority. You'd have to have a speaker who wants to keep the filibuster going and somebody ready to replace them present, so two minority members. You'd have to have the majority, someone in the chair and someone ready to raise objection to unanimous consent. So you have essentially equal weight on both parties. It's at least worth trying. Let me say that. I mean, in my head, it would be a vast improvement. We had a bill on energy efficiency that was defeated by the refusal to give 60 votes time and time again, a bipartisan bill of Portman and Shaheen, Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire, Senator Portman from Ohio. And I think 3 times it died on the floor for lack of 60 votes. This was a very simple energy efficiency bill. There is no way somebody would have talked through the night in order to block that bill, or talk through the weekend to block it. There was no really big division between the parties around which the parties would organize to do that. So smaller bills would get done, longer bills would be debated or major in public. I think it'd be very healthy for our democracy, and not to have this silent, hidden obstruction, and people go, why can't you get things done? Well, let me explain the very detailed inner workings. Nobody wants to hear about the details. You're the party in charge. So this was the secret of Gingrich. So Gingrich in the House side, when he came in, he said, or his philosophy was, look, he said, we have been cooperating with the Democrats and getting our pieces into their bills. And the result is we've been in the minority forever. We're going to change that. We're going to no cooperation, we're going to be as obstructive as possible. And then we're going to say to the voters, hold the majority accountable. And it worked. So Mitch McConnell, who is not yet a leader in the Senate, he said, Gingrich gives obstruction a good name. But on the Senate side, he has tools that Gingrich could never have dreamed of. He's got the nomination process that eats up enormous amounts of time, and he's got the 41 vote veto. And that combination meant that the Gingrich structure of power, which is obstruct the majority and then hold the majority accountable. The voters may not understand why the gears don't turn, but they know who's in charge, and they'll hold accountable the party in charge. And that has been a very successful strategy, deeply embedded now in kind of the DNA of the way the Senate's functioning.
Yeah, that's a very good point about obstruction and then blaming the majority party for failure to act. Yes. Let me ask you about, I think, maybe the most important question, which is, once you do this, let's say the Merkley talking filibuster is adopted, it becomes the precedent that the other party in all situations will use. So imagine a situation which is not, quite possible. Republicans gain control of the Senate. They hold control of the House. They win the 2024 election. And we look around the country, let's say Florida, or just the House of Representatives yesterday, and you can see the agenda. It's going to be things like the Parents' Bill of Rights, which would restrict certain books from being introduced. It would restrict the use of different gender markers, restrictions on abortion, perhaps restrictions on voting. All those things, without the power that the minority has had in the Senate to block, would now become possible. Does that worry you? I mean, flip the script. It's not just your progressive agenda that's being, blocked, but there is a pretty conservative agenda that a future set of progressives might want to block.
And this is a major concern among Democratic senators. Like we've been able to block certain things that we feel are just absolutely wrong, and maybe we won't be able to block them in the future. And my response to that is that you have to wrestle with whether or not the cycle can fulfill itself, in which a party advocates for an idea, debates it, decides how to vote, and then proceeds to see what the people think about it in the next election. You have to have that cycle. That cycle is completely broken right now because you can't complete that policy cycle. Now, let me give you an example, and that is the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. So Republicans said, eliminate it, eliminate it, eliminate it. And they voted in the House, like how many, 100 times? You just kept holding one vote after another, get rid of it, year after year, get rid of it, get rid of it. Okay, so now the Republicans are in charge in the Senate, and they are using the simple majority pathway when they blew up the Deficit Control Act and said, now we can now do tax policy through this simple majority pathway. So they said, okay, let's get rid of the taxes that fund the pieces of the Affordable Care Act. We can take down the Affordable Care Act by simple majority. So they had this simple majority pathway. And what happened? Well, a couple of their senators said, are you kidding me? Like, do you know how many people have extended Medicaid in our state? Do you know how many people are on the exchange in our state? Do you know what devastating this would be? No, this is a terrible idea. And then we had this very dramatic moment where essentially it came down to they needed McCain. And McCain was coming back from his brain cancer treatment. And we've been debating on into the morning. So it's about 1 a.m. He comes to the floor of the Senate, and McCain comes to a group of us in the well, and he leans over, he says, if we wrap this up tonight, do you think we can go to the Defense Authorization Act, which was his baby? And we're like, absolutely, of course. And then he disappears, and he goes and has a chat with the president. He has a conversation with Pence. And we're like, we don't know what he's going to do. Nobody knows what, the galleries are full. And he comes back onto the floor, and he walks up to the desk. He's about this far away from McConnell, McConnell's on one side of the desk. He's on the edge. The dais is right here. And he does what kind of mechanism. He would go up in front of the desk and then he'd wobble his hand like this, get the attention of the clerk. So he's wobbling his hand and everybody's watching his thumb go up, down, and then down. And there's this gasp. I mean, there was not a sound on the floor, not a sound in the gallery. The whole place, just a gasp. One of the most dramatic moments in American history. But when it came down to it, a policy that the whole Republican Party voted for time and time and time again, when it came to, is this really the smart policy? They couldn't deliver the majority, even on a simple majority, to do it. And so, but if they had, and if all those people had lost health care, how would the next election have come out? And I think it would have strengthened the Democrats' hand.
So I think that, that's a compelling case. On the other hand, when you're talking about the rights of a small numerical minority, let's say trans people in America, or you're talking about issues that may not inflame the passions of an entire country, like banning books, or maybe some other issues, maybe you don't get the galvanizing. I mean, I think you'd have to acknowledge that the risk that there will be policies that your rivals on the other side of the ideological spectrum favor, those may pass. It may pass. The Affordable Care Act, I grant, is a compelling case of an area where it was blocked, and you're talking filibuster may well have worked. But it seems to me that the space for other policies to pass, they may not have the extraordinary visibility and impact of the Affordable Care Act. That would be a different story, and I could see why it would worry Democrats, including liberal Democrats.
Yeah. This is the story in a democracy. You are not always on the winning side. You make your case. You criticize the other side when you think they've gone off track. You try to persuade the people, and the people decide. The key is the elections have to be fair. And this is the concern for the growth of authoritarianism around the world, is you see the institutions being eroded. We see the role of the courts being eroded in democracies. We see the voting, the groups that guide essentially how the vote is conducted are corrupted. The teams are fired, and maybe a president's friends are put in to design the next election. We see here in the United States targeted efforts in states to prevent certain groups from voting, primarily Blacks, Hispanics, low-income Americans, college students, and Native Americans on reservations. And those laws are targeted at making it hard for them to vote, because they generally vote Democratic. And once you erode the integrity of the elections, then authoritarianism can spin out of control. If the elections are protected, you have the ability to right the ship. And so there is a concern, and there is a concern on lots of other issues. There's issues that I've stood for. Oregon was the first state in the union to have a death with dignity law. And there was an effort to eliminate that. And it's possible that the proponents would have outlasted the opponents of it would have outlasted the proponents, for example, and they may have overruled the state's right to have that. I can tell you that the two Oregon senators would have done all they could to stretch that out as long as possible. But who knows? But to your point's taken, you're not going to win every single time. I will say the area that was of most concern was reproductive rights, and a lot of my Republican colleagues, they are terrified of legislating on that.
Yeah,
They want the courts to do that.
Yeah, I'm not mentioning abortion rights. I think after 2022, Republicans appreciate the intensity and the kind of go to the mat view among many Americans, including many women. And so I think, we've reached a good point here, which is there are these tremendous problems in the Senate and acting. And I think if Republicans were in the majority, or when they have been the majority, you hear plenty of Republicans talking also about changing the filibuster. And what you're saying is, yes, let us change the filibuster, your proposals for a talking filibuster, and then let's take it to the voters. If one party overreaches, then let's take it to the voters. If members of the Senate are not responsive to what the majority wants, and honestly, I think that's fair. I think that's a fair. We've got a bunch of questions here on other topics. Can we jump over to those? Okay, good.
How many folks support the talking filibuster now? A little bit of reform. How many said no? Keep the secret, silent, no-show filibuster. All right, nobody here is advocating for that.
No, but I bet if I ask the question slightly differently.
Okay, yeah, but
I want to ask you a few questions. You've been a leader in so many issues. Back in 2018, the New York Times described your actions on the southern border at a converted Walgreens center,
Walmart, yes.
Walmart center that was being used to incarcerate migrant children of migrant families who've been detained. You'd showed up there. You had streamed it live on Facebook. It was an extraordinary moment where you asked very politely, very calmly for access to facility to inspect it and give witness to what was going on there. And it I think galvanized the country. A lot of people, across party lines were just horrified at what they've seen, what they saw. Now we're in 2023. We've got a president who appears to be considering some policies that bear resemblance, particularly with regards to asylum seekers. What are your thoughts about the Biden policy and conversations about how to deal with immigrants coming or asylum seekers coming across the border?
I got involved in this partly by accident. In that I was reading a speech that Sessions had given on the southern border in California. And I read it and I said out loud, it sounds like he's planning to take children away from the parents in order to deter families from immigrating, like harm the children to discourage immigration. I said out loud, no American administration would ever do that, harm children as a strategy. And someone on my team, Lauren Oppenheimer, she said, well, there'd be one way to find out, go to the border. Well, okay. That Sunday, that couple days later, I went to the border. It's how I became the first member of Congress to actually see the spot where they were separating the children from the parents. And it actually wasn't at the Walmart. It was at a different facility. And I could not believe it when I saw these little kids inside these wire mesh cages that had been separated. And I said, well, where do you do this? And he says, we bring the family in the door there, and then we grab the youngster and we bring him over here. And so the story broke moments later when I went out and talked to the press about what was going on inside. And then I had heard a rumor that several hundred kids were being held at this Walmart up the road. We had asked for permission to visit it, but not been granted permission. And my team member, Ray Zaccaro, he said, should we go? It's a really hot day. It's pretty far away. I said, no, let's go. And I said, I'll just knock on the door and ask permission. And instead they called the cops to come arrest me. Yeah, they didn't arrest me, but they did kick me off the grounds. But it turned out that there were 1,500 boys being held in that Walmart who had been separated. Many of them, not all of them, some had crossed by themselves. And I just couldn't believe that. And it started this whole national revulsion. Be clear, the Biden administration is never going to do anything like that. However, they have used the health emergency in order to essentially keep the southern border closed. And they just put forward a proposal, the details of which I have not fully digested, but essentially it sounds like a way to say that you can apply for asylum, but only if you fit into certain categories, a way to really restrict the ability for people to seek asylum. Definitely under the Refugee Convention, we have a responsibility of somebody who claims asylum status to give them a chance to make their case. And the thing that worked in the past was the Family Case Management Program. Here is a great irony. The Trump administration said, there's this whole catch and release thing going on. So therefore, we need to shut down immigration, meaning you catch people crossing the border, they call for asylum, they're released, they never show up. Under two different inspector general's reports, of the family case management program and said, if they're assigned a caseworker, they show up. 99% plus show up because you know who they're staying with, you know who their relatives are, you know their phone number, you stay in touch with them. The first thing the Trump administration did, they shut down the family case management program. That's crazy. And so that system has to be cranked back up. And it has to be rebuilt. The asylum courts were just obliterated because essentially they're saying we're not going to hold these hearings. And those asylum courts have to be rebuilt. There needs to be the ability to have a several-month period in which people can put together their case. It's very hard to win asylum. You have to show a specific standard of threat if you're returned to your home country. And it's very hard to demonstrate that. But you've got to have a chance to present your case in a timely fashion, but not so long that you're waiting forever. We have a backlog for these asylum courts that is years in years it will take to clear it. And that has to change. So a reestablished families case management program, encouraging Biden team to do that. They formally did, but they haven't actually done the hirings to make it happen. Reestablish the asylum courts, get back control, and then honor the refugee convention. That's what I'm pushing Team Biden to do.
Are you concerned about how the Biden administration has been in power for 2 years? Are you proud of how they've handled immigration?
Well, let me frame it this way. The things I'm pushing for, family case management program, rebuilding the asylum courts, have not really happened, and they need to happen. And honor the refugee convention.
You have been a leader in the past on finance reform. You were an important voice during the Dodd-Frank legislative effort back in 2008. And you were a sponsor of something known as the Volcker Rule, named after the prior chair of the Federal Reserve Board. And what that rule did was to say to banks who were taking our deposits, which we assumed were safe, that you can't just take our money and then go bet it on risky investments. And you said, no, you can't do that. If you're going to be a bank taking deposits, then you can't act like you're at the gambling table with everyday folks' money. And so you've been following this. In the last couple of weeks, we've had another kind of scary moment with our banks, with the Silicon Valley Bank closing and then ripple effects. How do you analyze what is going on? Do you see a significant breakdown in our financial system? Do you see this as a kind of a one-off warning, but with very unique circumstances?
So very, very different than 2008, 2009. Not only the massive gambling, I called it the Wall Street casino, that was going on, but you had predatory loans, home loans, that were triple option loans. So if you essentially got to a certain point, you would have to go from a negatively amortizing loan to a loan that you're paying down and the payment could double, or you go from basically a teaser rate of 2% to a full rate of 9%. You couldn't make the payments. By the way, probably the best thing I've done as a senator was to lead and win the fight to end those predatory home loans. And it happened in the banking committee. Dodd heard me talking about it and said, you got to be on banking committee, lead this fight. I did. We stopped those predatory loans, and millions of American families have benefited from fair mortgages as a result. So this crisis is a little different. However, it does have lessons. The Silicon Valley Bank had huge amounts of cash pouring in from these high-tech companies, and they couldn't lend it out fast enough, and they put it into bonds. But when you have interest rates that go up, the value of the bond goes down. People pay less for it because they want to get the higher interest rate. And this meant that the value of their assets dropped. And then you have another factor, which is the kind of the connectedness of the Silicon Valley community. And within a few hours of people expressing concern, like, do they have enough assets to cover withdrawals? Everybody started making withdrawals, and they were taking out billions and billions and billions of dollars in a 6-hour period. And the bank didn't have enough liquidity to cover it. It probably didn't actually have enough capital assets to cover it either if they had everything had been able to convert to liquid, which is why they went down and why they were taken over. There are very few banks that are in that arrangement and therefore vulnerable in that same fashion. But what it does say is that you need to have, not just for the biggest banks, but for medium-sized significant banks, you've still got to have capital standards, liquidity standards, and you've got to have stress tests. And one of the things that you have to look at is the concentration of your assets. I found it very interesting. Back when I left DC, when I was a policy analyst for nuclear weapons, and then went back to Oregon and ran Habitat for Humanity. And then I developed affordable housing. And so I went to a community bank to get a construction loan. And no, it wasn't it was a takeout loan. So I was going to replace the construction loan. And the bank owner or manager said, hey, I've got several other affordable housing loans. I've got to go and check with the regulators to see if I can have another loan so I'm not too concentrated in any one sector. And I'm like, no nonprofit had ever failed to pay on one of these loans. And yet here he was with regulators saying, worry about concentration. Well, a regulator in the situation of Silicon Valley would have said, wow, you've got all these assets tied up in bonds. You do realize that we have very low interest rates right now, and if they go up, those bonds are going to drop in value. Don't you think, isn't this a concern here? But they didn't. And so there's a lesson there that regulation really matters. There's also another lesson, which is that in this day and age, when information travels this fast, we're going to have runs on other banks. Not because the bank has done something wrong, just because someone stirs up concern and everybody else said, well, I don't want to be the one waiting for 6 months to get my money out after my insured deposit finally clears. I better take it out now. And so you have to have the ability of these banks to be able to have a borrowing facility when they've been properly regulated and they're properly capitalized, so that essentially people say, well, there's no reason to have a run on the bank. They're solvent. They've been stress tested. We know that they can borrow the money if a bunch of us did decide to take our money out. And so,
I mean, the Federal Reserve did step up almost immediately a new facility for just that purpose.
Yes.
And they stood it up on Sunday. And then it didn't really slow much. I mean, there were more bank collapses. There were global effects. It is pretty impressive. I guess the big question that we're facing right now is the problem that regulatory powers were rolled back in 2018 during the Trump years with a bipartisan majority. This was not one of those partisan issues. A lot of Democrats on the side of rolling back parts of Dodd-Frank, including the banks that would be covered by the stress tests. So is it the issue not enough regulation? Or is the problem the regulators don't use the authority they have? Because as we dig into this, it's pretty clear that the Federal Reserve supervisors were giving warnings, a number of warnings to the Silicon Valley banks, and there was very little action. And so you kind of look at that and say, okay, the regulators may be the ones at fault here. How do you sort it out?
Well, first, I do need to note there's a tie-in between the Volcker rule that you brought up and the argument I've been making over the filibuster. I tried to get unanimous consent to bring up the Volcker rule on the floor of the Senate during the discussion of Dodd-Frank. And Mitch McConnell had been making trips up to Wall Street. There's no way he's going to allow that. I discovered that there was an open second-degree amendment slot on a germane amendment. We rewrote my amendment through the night. I got it attached, second-degree amendment, and shut down the Senate. Like, this had not happened forever that someone had pulled this off. Because in order to consider the first-degree amendment, which had to do with auto dealers, very popular amendment, they had to first consider the Volcker rule. And so the Republicans came to me and said, that was really rude to do that. And, really, you're breaking Senate protocol. And I said, I think that you're all objecting to my calling up this amendment is breaking Senate protocol, but I'll tell you, I'll take a deal. I will separate my second-degree amendment and take a floor debate, 60-vote requirement. And Mitch McConnell, the Republicans, said, no way. No way we're going to allow this amendment, which says that the big banks on Wall Street can no longer do proprietary betting, run this casino in this fashion. No way we're doing that. Why? because those big banks are massive campaign contributors. And that's my point, right to my point about the fact the amendment process is no longer available to take on the powerful. Now fast forwarding to back to the situation. I'm no longer on the banking committee now. So I'm not following it with as much detail as I did then. I think there's going to be a lot of hearings and examination. What did the regulators know? What kind of stresses did it put them through? The bill that you're referring to, I think it was 2018. I voted against. So sometimes you look back and go, how did I respond? And I was concerned about the rollback of the stress tests and the standards. And but as you point out, only a few of us voted against it. I do think the majority leader, by the way, voted against it as well, Senator Schumer from New York. And of course, there are a lot of big banks in New York. So that was a solid move. So there'll be a lot of examination of it. But I do not think this is nothing on the scale. This is a whole different level of issue. It does raise that new issue of fast runs with big deposits, but that just reinforces concentration of assets, liquidity standards, capital standards, and a lending facility.
I think that's a very fair point. And I think sometimes the media gets so worked up about, the possibility of disaster. They get ahead of themselves. So I think that's a good point. I mean, I would just put in my 2 cents. I think, and I agree with some Republicans in this, I think the issue is not necessarily regulatory power, because obviously the stress test would not have been picking up the change in interest rates. That's not the scope of the stress test. I do think the bigger problem is the Federal Reserve and the failure of the Federal Reserve to be a diligent regulator. I think there's a lot of challenges there. We have remarkably so quickly come to the end of our hour. I want to just ask you the last question. Been filtering in questions from all of you. Thank you for these terrific questions. Senator Merkley, how do you maintain optimism in light of the fact that it is so difficult in the Senate to pass meaningful legislation and respond to the country, as you've put it?
Well, I'm not that optimistic. I know. I mean, if you look at the arc of our country right now, you see that. So I came out of high school in 1974. And in the 3 decades that had preceded it, we'd had this great leap forward for the middle class in America. My mother had come from very poor circumstances, pre-Great Depression, born in 1927. Her mother had a previous marriage, had 3 children, was abandoned by her husband, lived in a train car, hand washed clothing for a living. The county took her 3 children away. She then remarried. My mother was born. Very, very intense Great Depression poverty. And then by the time I'm born and then on into 1974, I'm graduating from high school, this fabulous leap forward with a single mechanic's wages. My dad was a union mechanic. You could buy a home, you could own a car, you could go camping on vacations, you had indoor plumbing, you had wiring. I mean, world had really changed. And I thought, think about what's going to happen in the next 3 decades. Wow, think of what America is going to look like by the time 1974 becomes 2004. And instead, what we've seen is really a dramatic change in America. And I think, World War II said we're all in this together. And there was a sense of building the middle class. That wore off. And then you had the Reagan Revolution and anti-union feelings, and other forces came to work, kind of the structure of society being affected by the civil rights movement in Vietnam. And suddenly we're not all in together. There's protests, and those with assets started to be able to drive legislation that made the world better for them, rather than the fundamentals for families: healthcare, housing, education, good paying job. And that's accelerated over the last 3 decades to a massive inequality in wealth and income. And that wealth, when I started this, I said the wealthy have these multiple tools of lobbyists, lawyers, media campaigns, and now also have the filibuster. And so it comes back full circle, saying if we don't change the structure of our government so that you can actually put legislation up that fights for ordinary people, we're going to see the continuation of this arc in a way that's very unfavorable for a republic. Republics do not thrive in the context of massive inequality. And if you travel kind of the world and you see where democracy is trying to thrive in highly unequal nations, doesn't work too well. Eventually it breaks down. So that's why reforming the Senate is so important. And thank you all very much for having me
Thank you, Jeff
today.
Merkley.